So, if I understood well, this Hadrian walls has still a lot of secrets to explore. And I'm thinking, for example, of the recent discovery of certain wooden tablets in Vindolanda.
Yes.
By reading these different tablets, my question is this one, David. What was a normal day like in Hadrian Wall's camp or fort?
Yeah. Yes. I think if you wanted an answer in one word, I can give it you. Supply. Keeping going. Survival. Getting the food in.
Yeah.
Keeping the buildings under repair, keeping your armor under repair, bringing in new weapons and armor. There's quite a lot. I mean, the documents from Egypt are very similar to the ones from Vindolanda, showing that Roman soldiers are out collecting grain. They're supervising the purchase of blankets for the army. And it's very similar to what's happening, what the letters from Vindolanda tell us about the wonderful one about we need some more beer, please. We've run out of beer. I mean, one of the most fascinating ones, and it tells you quite a lot. It's so simple, but there's one document which shows how the Roman army did measure into fractions. Well, if you think about it, that's all to do with supply. They are measuring what they're getting, goods and whatever it is, down into fractions. It's to do with whatever is being brought in, which could be beer. There's a letter about the problem with the roads down to Catterick, so the supplies aren't coming in. So as frequently as they would like, as easily as they would like. So supply is a big issue. Training, of course. How often this happened, it's very difficult to tell. I mean, what we have are the military documents, which tell us, for example, that, but these are 4th century, that how the Roman army should train. But at the same time, we've got generals like Corbulo taking over the army on the eastern frontier and finding, according to Tacitus, of course, that so there were soldiers who'd never worn a breastplate, never been on guard duty. But we're back to how we interpret that. Even 5 years after a government is in power, is blaming all their ills on the previous government. And, so Corbulo could be just saying, oh, God, I've inherited this terrible situation. How much do we actually believe the details? But certainly, let's say, training. Training has to occur. We are told that. And we've got Josephus' comment, if I can get it the right way round, their training was bloodless bloodless exercises, and their battles were bloody exercises. They trained to fight. Controlling people, I think, will be the third. It's not easy to work out what they did altogether. We know that meeting places would be supervised by army officers. In the late 1st century, the people beyond the empire in what's now Germany complained that they could only come into the empire at a point specified by the Romans. They had to travel unarmed and under military supervision. So this is going to eat up quite a few of your more senior, possibly, perhaps more junior as well, officers and soldiers. So when we look at a frontier and we think about patrolling and keeping your ears open for potential trouble to the north, we don't have a lot of evidence to help us understand how frequent this was. But if we're looking at the three main activities of a soldier during his day, apart from eating, 2 meals a day, morning parade, of course, so the unit would parade, and the order will be issued for the day. We know this because we have 3 surviving, telling us what the security code was for the day. And that leads on to my final point, I think, administration, bureaucracy. A few years ago, I wrote a paper comparing Roman and modern bureaucracy because I worked as an archaeologist, but as a civil servant in a government department. And Roman bureaucracy was very similar to modern bureaucracy. let me assure you. And the Romans, you've got to, just imagine every soldier in the army, 400,000 men, had his own file. Every horse had its own file. Every day, a record of the morning report was written down. There were timetables for what soldiers should be doing each day. Only 1 or 2 survive. Every year, a report was filed with Rome, listing the strength of the unit. We tried to create our knowledge of the Roman Empire based upon half a dozen of these documents.
Yeah.
And you think how many 400 regiments in the Roman army in any one year, and it lasted for 400 years. You can do the maths, and we have 6 of these. So and then on top of that, we've got soldiers retiring and being recruited. So there's a process for recruitment, there's a process for retirement. The records went up to Rome, and a list was produced of which soldiers should get the privilege of citizenship, and this came back down the line. So administration is taking up a lot of time as well.
Thank you, David, for your answer. Do we have archaeological evidence of customs relations between Roman soldiers and the kingdoms or the population outside the empire? They could play a role of custom agent, these soldiers, or not at all?
Yeah. Well, we touched on this with Antoninus Pius giving a king to the Quadi, of course, in Britain, and we're to a large extent focusing on Hadrian's Wall. Well, I mean, we certainly do have evidence. In the year 197, there was a problem on the northern frontier. The Romans had lost some men as prisoners of war. So at this moment in time, they're on Hadrian's Wall, which runs from Newcastle to Carlisle and a bit beyond. 100 miles north of that was the Antonine Wall, and beyond that are the Caledonians and another big tribe, which are called the Maiartai, which we're not sure where they lived. So what we're told is that they broke their promises to Rome to keep the peace, i.e. treaties. So we can see that over 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall, about the year 200, the Roman state had treaty relations with the 2 biggest states, rather than tribes, I think we should call them, beyond the empire. And then right at the very end of Roman Britain, almost at the very end, we have a similar situation where we have some sort of treaty with the peoples beyond Hadrian's Wall, which collapsed. And the people who were in the middle started giving evidence on Roman activities and movements to the enemy to the north, rather than the other way around, which is what they should be doing, telling the Romans about what's happening to the Caledonians beyond. So absolutely, yes, on every frontier, there were these sorts of situations. what we tend to find, and this is the same with news, isn't it? Most of the news we have is bad news, not good news.
Yeah.
So a lot of our evidence comes from the breaking down of treaties rather than the creation of them. And we're lucky when we have such as a coin which says the emperor gave a king to the state just beyond his territory.
Thank you very much, David. You spoke about the Antonine War, but in a nutshell, David, what are the differences between this Hadrian Wall and this Antonine Wall? You spoke earlier that Antonine was an emperor, more bureaucratic than a soldier, finally. But if you could compare these two walls in two or three qualificatives.
Yes. I think we have to look beyond Rome, beyond Britain, I beg your pardon, beyond Britain. I mean, the frontier in Germany, as I said earlier on, was a very stout fence. Sometimes a line was just a bank of earth. What's unusual about the two frontiers in Britain is their size. And that includes the size of the ditch in front of each frontier. And this concerned the great German historian Theodor Mommsen 150 years ago. Why is it, he said, that the frontiers in Britain are so formidable, unlike the frontiers in Germany? And his answer was that it was because the enemy in Britain was more often knocking on the door of the empire, threatening the empire, than they were in Germany. I don't know. It is a problem. But let's start with. Can we start with Hadrian's Wall? Hadrian's Wall is interesting because it's enormous. Why is it? Why is part of it built in turf, part of it in stone? Now, I think one answer to this is Hadrian wanted a statement. You've introduced us to Hadrian and him as an emperor. I think it's very possible he wanted a statement. Okay, we're going to stop expanding. So you can imagine the conversation, which is not taking place in Britain, it's taking place on the lower Danube. So when he becomes emperor, he's in Antioch in modern Syria. And he comes to the Danube, crosses Turkey to the Danube, perhaps he sails around it, and then proceeds to Rome. And he probably met the bloke when he was in by the Danube Delta, he appointed governor of Britain. So he said, this is historical fiction. So he says to this governor, right, next job for you, you're off to Britain. There's a bit of a problem there, sort it out. And when it's sorted out, I want you to build a wall. Oh, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. What kind of wall do you want, sir? That's a good question. Hadrian thinks. Now, there aren't walls in existence. You know, one of the greatest problems in dealing with Hadrian's Wall is to think Newcastle out of your head. It's a great metropolis today, but it was a stinking little hovel on the muddy banks of the Tyne in the Roman period. So it's the same in the Roman period when we come to think about walls. There weren't any in the Western, no towns were defended apart from one or two, the Western Empire, but they had them around Greek cities. Hadrian was Grecophile, he'd been to Athens. Okay, I want a wall like the one around Athens. Okay, perhaps you could sketch it out. So what's interesting about Hadrian's Wall is the regularity of measuring, but Marcastle every mile, turrets, 2 turrets in between. Very tight measuring of these. It's as if it was, as Brian and I wrote now nearly 50 years ago, it's as if it was planned somewhere other than on Hadrian's Wall. It doesn't fit the landscape. So Hadrian, who fancied himself as an architect, we could envisage coming up with a scheme which was impractical on the ground, which is why there were major changes when it would appear he got to Britain. So Nepos comes to Britain, he deals with the problem, he starts building the wall, and then Hadrian arrives and he starts to change it. So That's the view, if you like, from the top. What about the view from down below? What's interesting about Hadrian's Wall is part of it is turf and part of it is stone. The western part is of turf. The western climate in Britain is wet. I know that. That's where I was brought up. So you get a lot of turf for cattle and animals, not so much fields for grain. By the time you get to the centre of Hadrian's Wall, and literally you're running eastwards, pretty well every site we've dug in modern times has evidence for agriculture below it. And I know because I found it, the fort I dug. Below the fort were fields. So it may be as simple. The Roman normal attitude for building ramparts was to start with turf. So the west end of the wall is turf. But by the time they got to, they're thinking about the central sector or the eastern sector, there's a lot of agriculture, not perhaps so much turf, but there's a lot of stone. And if you go to Housesteads today or that central sector, the turf isn't worth having because the rock is so close to the surface. So it may be simply the available materials that produced the wall that we have, turf or stone. So when they get to the Antonine Wall, what happens there? Well, the first two forts that they start to build are actually have stone walls, and one of them has a stone wing wall at each end, as if a stone wall is going to come up to them. Well, that doesn't happen. They changed the plan and they built it of turf and timber with a socking great ditch in front of part of it, at any rate. Now, the interesting thing about modern research is that it's demonstrated that this wall was carefully built. There's been a lot of discussion. Oh, gosh, it was just... And the Antonine Wall was just temporary measure. But the modern work by Edinburgh University is really very important. It's demonstrating, first of all, that the turfs that were used in the curbs of the wall's on a stone base. And then the turf is on top of that. We don't know how high it was, 3 meters perhaps, might have been more. And the turfs are held in by 2 curbs, and on each side. And these curbs are different turfs, brought, that is, from a different place than the turfs inside them that they held in place. So there's some one level of sophistication, what they wanted the turfs to do. When you get into the thickness of the wall, of the turf rampart, the turfs, you might expect, if that's a rampart, as it were, coming along, that the turfs would be laid parallel to the curve, the outside stone curves, but they're not. They're laid like that, which adds to the strength. So when we're looking at this is a sophisticated wall. It's not thrown up in a hurry. They choose where they get the turfs from. And it suggests very strongly that it's going to be permanent. So the Antonine Wall has regained a lot of interest. And it comes back to reflect a much wider political element for us. Why was it built? I believe, as Tony Burley said, it was to do with the emperor requiring a triumph. And he just took a very simple, straightforward step forward, 100 miles, built his new wall. But it wasn't thrown up as a temporary measure. This was a permanent solution, even though it didn't last as a permanent solution. Yes. But if you look at all the modern military machinery we've had, playing TSR-2, F-111, Blue Streak, rockets and so on, these don't last very long, do they, as defensive measures before something new is invented.
Thank you very much, David, for all your knowledge about these 2 walls, Antonine walls and Hadrian walls, and this brilliant comparison. And given the great archaeological and historical background, can we think that the Romans had displayed a great flexibility in the ways of organizing their numerous and diverse frontiers?
Yes, I think that one of the lessons we learn from Hadrian's Wall is the flexibility of the Roman military mind. Hadrian's Wall, as I mentioned, there were something like 20 changes. Some of them are not big changes, some of them were, but they are over a period of, well, we don't know how long it took to build Hadrian's Wall. I personally don't think it was finished when the emperor died, but let's say 16 years. They are adapting the wall. They start off with a very regular system, as I described, marcas and turrets. By the end of building it, they've dropped that, and they've gone back to normal patterns of placing the turrets where they are in the best viewpoints for observation. They moved the forts. They reduced the thickness of the wall. So it could be that we started out with a wall which was at base 10 Roman feet wide, and then they narrowed it. And that wall might have had a parapet walk, like a Greek city wall. Mm-hmm. But by the time they'd moved on, they'd put forts on the wall. So patrolling along the top of the wall wasn't so important because they had all these forts actually on the wall line. So they dropped the parapet. We don't know that, but we can guess. So there are all these changes. And that, to me, really demonstrates the flexibility of the Roman military mind. So when we also go and look at the empire elsewhere, we are seeing different things. We're seeing the use of different materials, so they respond to the local situation. If they can't get what they want locally, in Germany, they brought timbers 150 kilometers to use in the frontier because it was the timber they wanted. They built in the east types of forts which were best adapted to the climate. So if you look at Roman forts, they're much smaller, certainly in the late empire, than the early forts in Britain. And they are a square with the barracks against the inside of the walls, and are designed to provide shade, as you would. So they're adapting to the climate. Same in North Africa. And they're usually built of stone because there isn't much timber, obviously. So they're very adaptable. They relate themselves to the materials available to them. They relate themselves to the countryside. They don't bother to put forts where they don't need them. So the Middle Danube is, Upper Danube, my colleagues in the Middle Danube would say, oh, no, the Upper Danube, which is somewhere like the Wachau in Austria. There's a whole section downstream from Passau, which is the eastern edge of Germany against Austria. There are no forts because the banks are very steep. Today they're wooded, probably were wooded then. It's not easy to cross, so they didn't bother with a fort there. You go a little further downstream and you've got 5 forts in a very tight area. And that's because of 2 things. It's a good countryside, so there's a lot of people live there. They need protecting. And if you go to the north, you've got one of these big routes going north and coming south from Rome's enemies. So where the Romans might have expected an attack. And if you look at the disposition of the legions along this stretch, you've got them like at Carnuntum, which is almost at the Hungarian border, at the bottom end of the route which led all the way to the Baltic. Mm-hmm. So these forts are very carefully placed in relationship to the topography, the terrain, to people, to routes, and so on.
Wow. Thank you, David. Yes, I think the frontiers of the Roman Empire were well adapted locally at the diplomatic level, with the landscape dimension and the material and the natural resources available. And they were smart bureaucrats, but they were smart designers at the same time.
Yes. Yes.
David, we have reached the end of the interview, but I have 3 final and small questions. We haven't talked about the end of the Roman Empire. And my question is this one. Which borders were the most difficult and fragile to defend, and that could explain one of the reasons of the fall of the Roman Empire?
What I think, again, we have to look at the longue durée. The Roman army started out as an attacking force, an offensive force. Think of Caesar in Gaul. He conquered north of Provence. He conquered all of it in less than a decade with his offensive army. And then they had to put it somewhere. And gradually the army came to be placed on the outermost lines, which were the rivers in Europe. And these rivers became helped fossilize the frontiers because they were good supply routes. Shipping was moving up and down the rivers. The Danube was improved by cutting a towpath along the edge, for example. So gradually the troops fossilized on the edge of empire. And then from the 3rd century onwards, middle of the 3rd century, the empire came increasingly under pressure. There were civil wars, but there were pressures from the outside. And the emperor required, and there were sometimes several emperors at once, his own troops to be able to dash from here to there and deal with enemies. So gradually field armies were created. Mm-hmm. At first, they related to the emperor or his deputy, but gradually field armies were established, and these replaced the earlier offensive troops. The empire was reinventing itself, if you like. The army divided itself into these mobile troops and these fossilized on the frontier. But it became increasingly difficult, as you can imagine, to protect the whole empire. So what happened in Germany, we know very clearly. On the last night of the year in 406, a whole group of tribes from beyond the empire attacked and crossed the Rhine, if I remember rightly, when it was frozen, so they could get across it, and burst through through that thin line which was the frontier. And although the Romans fought on with their field armies, eventually they lost. Once the enemy was through that thin carapace, which was the frontier line, and the empire was in its weakened state, that was it. In the east, in the west. In Austria, we've got a very interesting account of what happened. Gradually, the frontier forts came under increasing pressure. They were just abandoned on the frontier. And as each one fell, the surviving troops moved back into another fort until they were all just based in one fort, and the rest had gone to their enemies. They tried to keep communication with Rome and failed. They sent the pay chest didn't arrive. They sent a group of soldiers to try to see what had happened, and they never returned. So we can see there two aspects. The big one of 3 different tribal conglomerations attacking, 3 peoples attacking the empire, and empire trying to fight it off with their field army. And in the east, in Central Europe, in Austria, further east, what we've got is it's a very human situation as to how the troops were rallied by the local bishop. They still lost. We don't have a clue what happened in Britain. We don't have a written record. We have to make it up looking at the examples that we do have. But there we've got 2 interesting accounts of how the end came.
Thank you, David. David, you were involved in the cultural protection of the frontiers of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Which sites in the frontiers of the Roman Empire have been classified as UNESCO World Heritage Sites?
Yes. I think the World Heritage Convention was signed, I think, in 1974. In 1984, the British government put forward their nominations, and one of these was Hadrian's Wall. So in 1987, Hadrian's Wall became a World Heritage Site, and it was, in fact, a sort of almost representative of all frontiers. But 10 years or so later, colleagues in Germany said, well, actually, our frontier in Germany is very much longer. And it would be a good idea if our frontier, with all the surviving remains, should be a World Heritage Site. And a few of us fortuitously met at a conference in 2001 and started to try to think through how we would deal with this. Because if Germany put forward its frontier, Austria would follow, then Hungary, Romania. I would propose, as I did, the Antonine Wall in addition to Hadrian's Wall. So what we hoped we would have one World Heritage Site, which was all the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Didn't work out like that, but still a lot have become individual sections. So one sector is the linear barriers. So Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, the German frontier is that World Heritage Site. The lower Rhineland, which is a very distinctive sort of watery frontier, is a World Heritage Site. Central Europe, which is Bavaria, Slovakia, and Austria, is another World Heritage Site. So now we have the whole frontier from the mouth of the River Clyde in Scotland to the fort of Itza in Slovakia, all has World Heritage Site status. Mm-hmm. Dacia, modern Romania, that proposal is in with UNESCO at the moment. Sometime next summer, we should have an answer. And of course, discussions carry on with colleagues in North Africa and the Middle East as to whether we can move forward there as well.
Thank you, David. Last question. How is archaeology an interesting and relevant discipline for border studies research today?
Yes. I mentioned Passau in, let me think, 2018. I was in Passau at the beginning of the Congress of Roman Frontier Studies. Exactly at that time that, what was it, 1 million refugees, enormous numbers of refugees. The person who was going to own the Congress and come from Hungary couldn't get there because the railway stations were all full of immigrants. And what is one answer to this is to build walls. So if you look at, say, the wall that the Israelis have built to keep out Palestinian bombers, very similar to a Roman frontier. It's got walls, metal in this case, high, so you can't scale them. There's a road runners along the side of it for easy communication along it. If you look at a picture of the Berlin Wall or the Iron Curtain Wall, it's very similar to a Roman frontier. You've got a linear barrier, towers for observation, just like on Hadrian's Wall, caltrops, big obstacles in front of it, just like Hadrian's Wall. So for a start, we learn something about trying to understand human nature, controlling access to our space and how we do it and how we want to do it. And most military studies actually would be wise, modern military studies, to look at how the Romans did it, because they were very successful for 400 years, which is more than any of our wars have been. Mm. But yes, there is great relevance. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire protected itself with lots of forts. So did Venice. I mean, if you go on holiday along many coasts in Mediterranean, you'll come across the forts built by Venice. So I think studying Roman frontiers fits into a pattern and offers another way of looking at how we control access to our space. And it carries a certain, Hadrian's Wall certainly does, an emotive element to it. I don't know if you picked up, but in late September, an iconic tree was chopped down on Hadrian's Wall. Did you hear this?
No.
No. Have you seen Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman?
Yeah.
Yes. They go from Dover to Nottingham via Hadrian's Wall. And they save a boy in the tree, which is being attacked by the sheriff's men. That tree is the one that was chopped down on Hadrian's Wall one night in late September this year. And I must have walked past that tree for 20 years before the film and thought nothing of it. It was a tree next to Hadrian's Wall. There are other trees, but it became very famous, and there's been a lot of unhappiness. So first of all, I wrote an article and said, let's not worry too much. There are other iconic views of Hadrian's Wall that have been in the past. Look at these, and other ones will come to mind. And then I thought, actually, I've got a lot of friends who work on Hadrian's Wall, and we all have a favourite view. So on the night of the, I think the 8th or 9th of October, I wrote to 40 of my friends and said, I'm going to produce a book of your favourite places on Hadrian's Wall. Within 24 hours, I had 30 odd responses. I've now got 70 contributions offered, and only 2 are the same. It's amazing. Only 2 are the same.
Wow.
And one of the things I've been talking to colleagues about is what this tells us about our feelings for Hadrian's Wall. Everybody has their favourite place, but the emotion that often goes with this, I mean, the one that came in this afternoon from Paul Kitching, postgrad student in Durham, starts off with Thucydides, talking about Athens and protection of Athens and so on. There's a lot of emotion flows into this. A lot of it is about their first excavation, but it's their first visit to Hadrian's Wall. And one of my Dutch colleagues was writing back to me today saying, this is quite amazing when you think about it. It's not just the research that's going on into Hadrian's Wall, but it's the, if you like, emotive appeal that it still has for us today.
Yeah.
So in a different answer to your question, there is, for a lot of people, a great pull towards Hadrian's Wall, a reason why we want to study it and protect it in the way that you have said, through making it a World Heritage Site. David,
it was an amazing discussion with archeological depth and narratives, very strong historical narratives with a lot of evidences. I was very happy to hear your knowledge, and thank you very much for sharing all of your knowledge about, and your passion about the Roman Empire and the frontiers of the Roman Empire, and specifically Hadrian's Wall.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Ben, for inviting me to join you.
Thank you, David. That was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention, and see you next month for the next issue. Bye-bye.